3. Constructing a novel. 1. For convenience of division, it may be said that the novel of psychology was born in France, the novel of manners in England, and that out of their union in the glorious brain of Balzac sprang that strange chameleon creature, the modern novel, which changes its shape and color with every subject on which it rests. In the general muster of novel of manners will be found to have played the most important part, and here English influences predominate. If innate aptitude were enough for the producing of a work of art, the flowering of the English novel of manners in the late 18th and early 19th century might have surpassed in quality and intrinsic importance that of all other schools. Balzac's debt to Scott has already been touched on. That of the earlier French fiction to Richardson and Sterne is as commonplace in the history of the novel. But the true orientation of English fiction was away from the fine-drawn analysis of Richardson, the desultory humors of Sterne, in the direction of an ample and powerful novel of manners. Smollett and Fielding brought fresh air and noise, the rough and tumble of the street, the ribaldry of the tavern, into the ceremonious drawing-rooms depicted by Richardson and later by Miss Burney. The distinguishing gift of the English novelist was a homely simplicity combined with an observation at once keen and indulgent. Good humor was the atmosphere and irony the flavor of this great school of observers, from Fielding to George Eliot. Till the day of Jane Austen, it had been possible to treat without apology of the mixed affair of living, but Jane Austen's delicate genius flourished on the very edge of a tidal wave of prudery. Already Scott was averting his eyes from facts on which the maiden novelist in her rectory parlor had looked unperturbed. When Thackeray and Dickens rose in their might, the chains were forged and the status draped. In the melancholy preface of Pendennis, Thackeray puts the case bitterly and forcibly. Since the author of Tom Jones was buried, no writer of fiction among us has been permitted to depict to his utmost power a man. And the stunted conclusion of a tale so largely begun testifies to the benumbing effect of the new restrictions. The novels of Charlotte Bronte, which now seem in some respects so romantically unreal, were denounced for sensuality and immorality, and for a time English fiction was in danger of dwindling to the pale parables of Miss Murlock and Miss Yonge. But the reaction against truth, this sudden fear of touching on any of the real issues of the human comedy and tragedy, Thackeray's natural endowment would have placed him with the very greatest. Trollope might conceivably have been a lesser Jane Austen, and George Eliot, perhaps born with the richest gifts of any English novelist since Thackeray, might have poured out her treasures of wit and irony and tenderness without continually pausing to denounce and exhort. But the artist depends on atmosphere for the proper development of his gift, and all these novelists were cramped by the hazard of a social convention from which their continental contemporaries had the good fortune to escape. The artist of other races has always been not only permitted but enjoyed to see life whole, and it is this, far more than any superiority of genius, that lifts Balzac, Stendhal, and Tolstoy so high above even Thackeray when the universal values are to be appraised. The great continental novelists are all the avowed debtors of their English predecessors. They took the English novel of manners in its amplitude, its merriment and pathos, and in their hands the thing became a trumpet. In one respect the English novelists are still supreme, and that is in the diffusion of good humor, good manners one might almost say, which envelops their comedy and tragedy. Much that is savage and acrimonious in the French, dolorous and overwrought in the Russians, is strained away through this fine English bonhomie, leaving a clear, bright draught, not very intoxicating or even stimulating, but refreshing and full of a lasting savor. Nor does this prevalent good humor hinder the full expression of tragedy. It helps rather to extract the final bitterness from certain scenes in Pendennis and Vanity Fair, in Middlemarch and the Chronicles of Barsetshire, The last years of Lydgate, the last hour of Mrs. Proudie, seem the most terrible for being muffled in a secure and decent atmosphere of fair play and plum-pudding. Since then, all the restraints of prudery which hampered the English novelists of the 19th century have come down with a crash, and the now that it can be told school, as someone has wittily named it, has rushed to the opposite excess of dirt for dirt's sake, from which no real work of art has ever sprung. Such a reaction was inevitable. No one who remembers the Butler's great novel, The Way of All Flesh, remained unpublished for over 20 years because it dealt soberly but sincerely with the chief springs of human conduct, can wonder that laborious monuments of schoolboy pornography are now mistaken for works of genius by a public ignorant of Rabelais and unaware of Apuleius. The balance will right itself with the habit of freedom. The new novelist will learn that it is even more necessary to see life steadily than to recount it whole, and by that time a more thoughtful public may be ripe for the enjoyment of a riper art. 2. Most novels, for convenient survey, may be grouped under one or the other of three types: manners, character or psychology, and adventure. These designations may be thought to describe the different methods sufficiently, but as a typical example of each, Vanity Fair for the first, Madame Bovary for the second, and for the third, Rob Roy or The Master of Ballantrae might be named. This grouping must be further stretched to include as subdivisions what might be called the farcical novel of manners, the romance and the philosophical romance, and immediately Pickwick for the first, Harry Richmond, La Chartreuse de Parme, or Lorna Doone for the second, and Wilhelm Meister or Marius the Epicurean for the third category, suggest themselves to the reader. Lastly, in the zone of the unclassified float such enchanting hybrids as John Inglesant, Lavengro, and the great Swiss novel, Der Grüne Heinrich, in which fantasy, romance, and the homeliest realities are so intimately mingled. It will be noticed that in the last two groups, of romance pure or hybrid, but one French novel has been cited. The French genius, which made romanticism its own, after borrowing it from England, has seldom touched even the hem of romance. Tristan and Iseult and their long line of descendants come from Brocaland, not from the Ile-de-France. Before going farther, it should be added that, in a study of the modern novel, the last named of the three principal groups, the novel of adventure, is the least important because the least modern. That this implies any depreciation of the type in itself will not for a moment be admitted by a writer whose memory rings with the joyous clatter of Dumas the Elder, Herman Melville, Captain Marryat, and Stevenson. But their gallant yarns might have been sung to the minstrel's harp before Roland and his peers, and told in Babylonian bazaars to Joseph and his brethren. The tale of adventure is essentially the parent stock of all subsequent varieties of the novel, and its modern tellers have introduced few innovations in what was already a perfect formula, created in the dawn of time by the world-old appeal, tell us another story. All attempts at classification may seem to belong to school examinations and textbooks, and to reduce the matter to the level of the famous examination paper which, in reference to Woodworth's "O cuckoo, shall I call thee bird?" or "What a wandering voice?" instructed the students to state alternative preferred with reasons for your choice. In a sense, classification is always arbitrary and belittling, yet to the novelist's mind such distinctions represent organic realities. It does not much matter under what heading a schoolgirl is taught to class Vanity Fair, but from the creator's point of view, classification means the choice of a manner and of an angle of vision, and it mattered greatly that Thackeray knew just how he meant to envisage his subject, which might have been dealt with merely as the tale of an adventuress, or merely as the romance of an honest couple, or merely as an historical novel, and is all of these, and how much more besides, is indeed all that its title promises. The very fact that so many subjects contain the element of 2 or 3 different types of novels makes it one of the novelist's first cares to decide which method he means to use. Balzac, for instance, gives us in Le Périgord and in Eugénie Grandet two different ways of dealing with subjects that contain, after all, much the same elements, in that one englobing his tragic father in a vast social panorama, and the other projecting his miser, who should have given the tale its name, in huge Molieresque relief against the narrow background of a sleepy provincial town peopled by 3 or 4 carefully subordinated characters. There is another kind of hybrid novel, but in which the manner rather than the matter may be so characterized. The novel written almost entirely in dialogue, after the style, say, of Gyp's successful tales. It is open to discussion whether any particular class of subjects calls for this treatment. Henry James thought so, and The Oddly Contrived Awkward Age was a convinced attempt on his part to write a little thing in the manner of Gyp, a resemblance which few readers would have perceived had he not pointed it out. Strangely enough, he was persuaded that his certain subjects not falling into the stage categories require nevertheless to be chattered rather than narrated, and more strangely still that The Awkward Age, that delicate and subtle case, all half-lights and shades, all innuendos, gradations, and transitions, was typically made for such treatment. His hypersensitiveness to any comment on his own work made it difficult to discuss the question with him, but his greatest admirers will probably feel that The Awkward Age lost more than it gained by being powered into dialogue, and that, had it been treated as a novel instead of a kind of hybrid play, the obligation of straight narrative might have compelled him to face and elucidate the central problem instead of suffering it to lose itself in a tangle of talk. At any rate, such an instance will probably not do much to convince either novelists or their readers of the advantage of the talked novel. As a matter of fact, the mode of presentation to the reader, that central difficulty of the whole affair, must always be determined by the nature of the subject, and the subject which instantly calls for dialogue seems as instantly to range itself among those demanding for their full setting forth and special artifices of the theatre. The immense superiority of the novel for any subject in which situation is not paramount is just that freedom, that ease in passing from one form of presentation to the other, and that possibility of explaining and elucidating by the way which the narrative permits. Convention is the first necessity of all art, but there seems no reason for adding the shackles of another form to those imposed by one's own. Narrative, with all its suppleness and variety, its range from great orchestral effects to the frail vibration of a single string, should furnish the substance of the novel. Dialogue, the precious adjunct, should never be more than an adjunct, and one to be used as skillfully and sparingly as a drop of condiment which flavors a whole dish. The use of dialogue in fiction seems to be one of the few things about which a fairly definite rule may be laid down. It should be reserved for the culminating moments, and regarded as the spray into which the great wave of narrative breaks in curving toward the watcher on the shore. This lifting and scattering of the wave, the coruscation of the spray, even the mere material sight of the page broken into short, uneven paragraphs, all help to reinforce the contrast between such climaxes and the smooth-of-face gliding of the narrative intervals, and the contrast enhances that sense of the passage of time for the producing of which the writer has to depend on his intervening narration. Thus the sparing use of dialogue not only serves to emphasize the crisis of the tale, but to give it as a whole a great effect of continuous development. Another argument against the substitution of dialogue for narrative is the wastefulness and roundaboutness of the method. The greater effective animation of presentness produced by its excessive use will not help the reader through more than half the book. Whatever its subject, after that he will perceive that he is to be made to pay before the end for his too facile passage through the earlier chapters. The reason is inherent in the method. When, in real life, 2 or more people are talking together, all that is understood between them is left out of their talk. But when the novelist uses conversation as a means not only of accentuating but of carrying on his tale, his characters have to tell each other many things that each already knows the other knows. To avoid the resulting shock of improbability, Their dialogue must be so diluted with irrelevant touches of realistic commonplace, with what might be described as by-talk, that, as in the least good of Trollope's tales, it rambles on for page after page before the reader, resignedly marking time, arrives, bewildered and weary, at a point to which one paragraph of narrative should have carried him. You've made it through Constructing a Novel 1 and 2. Like, share, subscribe. Check out the merch on Redbubble and Zazzle. Bye.